Did you ever hear of the Lewis and Clark encounters with unknown creatures? In the early 1800s, the great explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out on a daring expedition to explore the wild and untamed lands of the American West. They were tasked by President Thomas Jefferson to find a route to the Pacific Ocean, but little did they know that they would encounter creatures unlike any they had ever seen before. As they journeyed deeper into the wilderness, Lewis and Clark began to hear strange noises echoing through the trees. At first, they dismissed them as the sounds of ordinary forest creatures. But as the days went by, the noises grew louder and more ominous. One evening, as they camped by a roaring river, they heard a low growling sound that made their hair stand on end. Clark grabbed his rifle and cautiously approached the woods, but he found nothing. However, when he returned to camp, he noticed that their supplies had been tampered with. Some of the food had been eaten, and their blankets had been torn to shreds. The following day, they continued their journey, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They saw strange footprints in the mud, larger than any human or animal they had ever encountered. The prints were humanoid in shape, but twice as large as any human foot. As they traveled deeper into the woods, the noises grew louder and more frequent. They heard howls, growls, and even what sounded like human voices. One night, as they huddled around the fire, they heard a piercing scream that made their blood run cold. They quickly armed themselves and waited for whatever was making the noise to reveal itself, but nothing came. The next day, they came across a clearing in the woods. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by tall trees and bathed in sunlight. But as they approached, they saw something that made them gasp in shock. In the center of the clearing stood a creature unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was humanoid in shape, but it stood at least 10 feet tall and was covered in thick, shaggy fur. Its eyes glinted in the sunlight, and its teeth were as long as knives. Lewis and Clark were frozen in terror, but the creature didn't seem to notice them. It simply stood in the clearing, looking around as if it were lost. After a few moments, it lumbered off into the woods, disappearing from sight. The two explorers were shaken to their core. They had heard stories of wild beasts and monsters in the woods, but they had never believed them until now. They knew that they had to be careful if they wanted to make it back alive. As they continued their journey, they encountered more and more strange creatures. They saw creatures that looked like giant birds with wingspans as wide as a man was tall. They saw creatures that looked like serpents with legs slithering through the underbrush. And they even saw creatures that looked like trees with gnarled roots for feet and bark for skin. But the most terrifying encounter they had was with a creature that looked like a bear. But it wasn't a bear. It was almost twice as large and stood on its hind legs like a man. They estimated it to be over 12 feet in height. It had self-illuminating eyes glowing like hot coals in the darkness. Its roar echoed through the woods like thunder. Lewis and Clark knew that they had to be careful, but they were determined to press on. As they neared the end of their journey, they began to hear whispers of a creature that was said to be the king of the forest. It was said to be bigger and more powerful than any creature they had encountered so far, and it was said to be fiercely territorial. Despite their fear, Lewis and Clark were determined to find this creature and document its existence. They set out into the woods, armed with their rifles and a sense of adventure. After a few days of searching, they came across a massive tree that had been uprooted and torn apart. They knew that this was the work of the king of the forest, and they followed the trail of destruction deeper into the woods. As they walked, they noticed that the woods grew quieter and quieter. The birds stopped singing, and the insects stopped buzzing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, they came to a clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing stood a creature unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was easily 12 feet tall, with fur as black as midnight and eyes that glowed like embers. The creature roared, and the sound shook the ground beneath their feet. Lewis and Clark aimed their rifles, but they knew that their weapons were no match for this creature. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, and Lewis and Clark were thrown to the ground. They scrambled to their feet and ran as fast as they could, with the creature hot on their heels. As they ran, they heard the creature's footsteps pounding the ground behind them. They knew that they were no match for this beast, but they refused to give up. Finally, they emerged from the woods and onto the banks of a wide river. They saw a canoe tied up on the shore and knew that it was their only chance. They untied the canoe and jumped in, paddling with all their might. As they paddled downstream, they looked back and saw the creature standing on the shore, watching them with its glowing eyes. They knew that they had encountered something truly extraordinary, and they would never forget the creatures they had encountered in the woods. Years later, when they returned to civilization, they told their tale to anyone who would listen. They were met with skepticism and disbelief, but they knew what they had seen. They had encountered unknown creatures in the woods, creatures that defied explanation and imagination. And to this day, people still tell stories of the creatures that Lewis and Clark encountered on their expedition. They may seem like tall tales, but for those who were there, they were as real as the woods themselves.